Welcome to Beyond the Summit, Trinity College's podcast that looks at accomplished alumni and asks them how they became who they are. Welcome to our third season, where we're spending time talking with alumni whose post-college careers have involved working or volunteering in the sports world. I'm your host, Paul Sullivan, Trinity class of 1995. With me today is Dave Lynch, class of 1993. He was a swimmer for his 4 years at Trinity, and turns out he and I played water polo together for 2 years. Dave is the Vice President of Sponsorships and Partnership Management at the National Football League, where he's been for the past 15 years. Dave oversees the NFL's portfolio of official sponsors and leads some of the league's largest partnerships, including Microsoft, Bose, Visa, Verizon, U.S.A, Oakley, and Nationwide. Prior to the NFL, Dave spent 5 years at the NBA within its corporate partnership group, overseeing various high-profile relationships such as Verizon, AOL, and General Motors. Dave started his career at Advantage International Octagon in both event management and corporate consulting roles. Welcome to Beyond the Summit, Dave. Thanks so much for joining me.
You bet, Paul. Great to be here.
Yeah, there's so much I want to talk to you about. Let's start at the beginning. What have athletics meant in your life? What do they mean to you, growing up as a kid?
Yeah, well, I grew up in Connecticut, in a town, North Haven, Connecticut, and lived in a neighborhood where it seemed that there were 2 or 3 kids my age in every single house. And because of that, I just naturally gravitated to playing sports. It seemed all year round. And at the time it was just fun. I was playing lacrosse, I was playing baseball, I was playing football, I was swimming, tennis, all the above, like that I guess a lot of kids experience. But as I got into high school, started to sort of dial in the focus on sports, and was lucky enough to play 3 sports at a school called Hopkins in New Haven. And then when I was looking at colleges, it was such a part of who I was, and I just enjoyed it. I wasn't some all-American athlete, but it was something I just enjoyed and gravitated towards. When I was looking at colleges, there were some D1 looks, and again, not pretending I was going to get any scholarships or was going to be a professional athlete, but at that time, getting looks from some D1 schools for more so lacrosse than swimming, actually. But Trinity was one of the last schools that I looked at, and I went, shockingly, not during the school year, I think that the students were off campus. And I just fell in love with the campus. I just walked on the campus and walked the quad, and had a conversation with the lacrosse coach and the swim coach, and walked away saying, holy cow, I literally withdrew some applications that I had already put in and started to focus on Trinity big time.
Did you play lacrosse at Trinity as well?
I did, but just 1 year. Yeah, okay. 1 year. Yeah.
Wow. Now, when you were swimming, who was the coach? Was it Chet McPhee, or did I?
It was Chet McPhee, right? Yeah, the great Chet McPhee.
Pretty good.
Just for and you may recall, but Chet was just a father figure to a lot of people, and just a genuine person. He recruited. There were 3 of us, actually all from Connecticut, that he recruited pretty hard in my year. A good friend named Rob Lanoy, another good friend named Luke McCarthy, who you might remember, Paul. But just all 3 of us came in with different specialties, and ended up having a lot of success and a lot of fun while doing it as well. So yeah, it was a lot of fun.
When you look back and think of the difference between, playing those sports in your neighborhood, and I know you had an older brother, I'm sure that made you pretty competitive. Playing the sports in the neighborhood, playing, at Hopkins, and kind of, focusing a bit more, and then making that leap to Trinity, to Division III school. What were the, talk to me about the progression. What was the difference in what you had to do as
yeah, it's a great question. I recall the swim program at Hopkins was pretty intense. We were again, I had a pretty good class of 89 at Hopkins, where a lot of us went on to swim in college, Wesleyan, Tufts, Williams, et cetera. A lot of the, D3 schools, which was at the time, just a pretty popular from the Hopkins students. as far as those who wanted to continue to compete athletically. So the transition for me it was a pretty intense program at Hopkins. And when I went to Trinity at D3, and Chet is looking down at me smiling, I'm pretty sure my Hopkins team probably could have beat the Trinity team. So we were pretty strong in high school, but it was fascinating to me that because it was a little bit more casual, my times dropped drastically. And part of it was I'm certain that I continued to develop physically, but there was a pressure dynamic that was no longer on my shoulders that I think allowed me to have even more fun doing it. So my backstroke time, and anybody who might be listening to this who's a swimmer, I think my 100 backstroke time dropped 4 seconds from when I was at Hopkins setting records at Hopkins. And then when I went to Trinity, it was just and I think that, again, I attribute that to largely Chet and the folks and my teammates on the team, that we just had a really fun environment. Guys like John Donahue, you may recall, and several others, that we just had a great dynamic, had a lot of fun, and it was more casual to me. Certainly the competitive spirit was certainly there, but it was this great environment of, being in a co-ed sport, which is pretty unique as well, where you're practicing together and you're spending a lot of time together that I did have in high school as well. But Trinity was definitely a little bit more fun. That's the way I describe it.
When I've talked to a lot of athletes, college athletes, but all professional athletes, when they, success is great, winning is great, but almost every single one of them has a story about a coach or a mentor who meant a lot to them. And not just, look, if you're playing in the NFL and you're a star quarterback, that's a different level. But for, Division III sports, when you think about maybe Chet, maybe somebody else in athletics, what was the mentorship that they provided? And what are are there lessons that you still think about today that you learned when you were at Trinity swimming?
Yeah, it's a great question, Paul. And I probably have two extremes on that question. I'll stick with the positive one, but Chet McPhee was somebody who was recruiting pretty hard, had been obviously with the school a long time. When I finally got there, did a really good job to his credit, you may recall the original pool that we had. I don't know if you were there then, but
no, I was. It was a great old classic pool, which I love. Yeah, but it was small.
Yeah, so 4-lane pool, that basically looked like a dungeon. But Chet had this vision of creating a new pool, and convinced a lot of us, the 3 guys that I mentioned, that was something coming, and really leaned into who we were. Right, it was for Chet. He wanted us to have fun. He wanted to compete. He wanted to have a good program, but he wanted us to have fun. The story that I remember most vividly with Chet, or one of, was, I think it was my sophomore year, and this happens to a lot of swimmers. I was having probably the best season I've ever had swimming, and halfway through the year, I came to the pool, and I was standing at the edge of the pool to dive into practice, and I couldn't get in. I couldn't convince my body, my head, my mind to jump in the pool and swim 8,000 yards, rotating my arms back and forth. And it's basically a mental block. It's a burnout. And it's pretty common in swimming, where people, at least once during their careers, actually burn out. And Chet knew right away. He saw me standing at the edge of the pool, just staring at the water, and knew right away. He came over to me and said, "Listen, I've seen this before. I've been doing this a long time. You don't have to say anything. Go take some time off. Just don't walk away. Just, don't walk away and quit," was what he said. He said, I know what's going on. You don't have to say anything. Just go take a couple of days and just get your head right. And let's talk in 3 days. And it's exactly what I did. And I took some time, was able to just, I wasn't like freaking out. It just, school was fine, but it was just, I couldn't get in the water and rotate my arms anymore, my shoulders. So I took that time off, and it ended up being exactly what I needed. Came back stronger than ever, refreshed, and finished out, the rest of the season and subsequent years, on the team. Yeah. So that to me is really, that's something that really sticks with me, that most coaches wouldn't handle it that way. It would be maybe perhaps a little bit more aggressive, or not understanding what I was going through, and, recognizing that from a distance was pretty impressive.
That's fantastic. Because I think about it now, today, 2 years into this pandemic and sort of burnout at work, but to have recognized back in the very early '90s, what was going on, and we just went through the Olympics, and the mental strain on a lot of these athletes. That's pretty impressive that
Yeah,
he was that astute and noticed that.
yeah.
Um, when you think about, you know, memories of Trinity beyond the pool,
Mhm.
um, what are some of the classes or some of the professors who stand out for you?
Yeah, I was thinking about this before we even got on the call, and it was interesting for me. I came into Trinity. I don't know why I thought this, but I wanted to be a math major, um, which is shocking. But so I was heavy in econ. I remember Professor Zanoni. The ones that I remember having the most fun with were, and I don't know if I think he was right. Yeah, he was certainly around when you were there. Was Professor Chatfield with U.S.
Oh,
history,
of
and
course.
again, that was
Yeah, Jack Chatfield.
just
Yep.
yeah, right. So another
Yeah.
professor that just I think was able to create a great dynamic within the classroom, where kids would and students would lean in, right, versus lean out and feel like, oh, I have to go to class, or he actually had a great demeanor and dynamic. I think that pulled you in a wonderful way to lean into history, and just something that he's the one that I remember most, that comes first at the top of mind for me.
Yeah. Were you a history major?
No, I so came in thinking I was going to be a math major, switched to econ, and then after 2 years had this, epiphany or whatever was going on in the world, where I said, you know what, I want to be a little bit more understanding what's going on globally throughout the world. And so I switched to international relations and really focused more on, just took advantage of that liberal arts education where I didn't really focus on one thing. It was for me an ability to just absorb, right? Like
Yeah.
learn and absorb. I had friends that came in knowing they wanted to go to medical school, so they focused in that space, or they wanted to go to business school, so they focused in that space. But for me, Trinity was a wonderful experience because I didn't feel pressure to do any one thing. I think I made up my minor when I was there: human culture, religion, and behavior. Right? It didn't exist. I just made it
Right.
up, and it was because those were the classes I was interested in, and I was able to just absorb and like a sponge as much as I could in the years that I was there.
I mean, I was a history major, and I remember I wanted to go to Ireland because I grew up in Western Massachusetts. I'd never traveled outside of the country, and so I thought, what I was a I was a super studious kid. I was a Trinity tripod, and all that. And I was like,
Mhm.
what am I going to do? And so I invented a minor as well, and it was Irish studies, which was essentially all the courses I took when I was studying abroad counted toward my minor. But I also remember, um, you said it, and we're going to sound like advertisements for the liberal arts education, but coming in and
Mhm.
taking advantage was so important. But there was a moment in time where I thought, geez, I don't know what I'm going to do in life. Went on to become a journalist, but I can't, I'd like to major in art history, but I don't think I can major in art history. That doesn't sound practical. And I told this story a couple summers ago at a Trinity event where my good friend Charlie Adams, who was in my class, was his wife was there, and he was an art history major, and Charlie went on to become an investment banker focused on healthcare. So it was this moment where it doesn't really matter. Like it's that passion that you have that
Yeah.
drives you to learn, not particularly what you study. When you were finishing up, your last year or so at Trinity, um, back then there wasn't a sort of pipeline to go into sort of sports marketing. There was a pipeline to go into consulting. There was a pipeline to go into investment banking. As you said, a lot of kids. I always felt bad for them. The medical school route. I mean, those kids they were in the lab all the time. But what did you think you were going to do as you were kind of wrapping up, senior year?
Yeah, again a great question for me. Um, I was watching a lot of my friends and fraternity brothers. Another, well, I won't put myself in his league, but somebody like Sam Kennedy, who was, you know, interning with, I think, the Mets, or maybe the Yankees, a couple summers while he was in school. And I honestly remember asking him, like, what are you doing? Like, go have fun in the summer. Why are you working? And he just said, no, I love it. And I think this is what I want to do. And I didn't get that. I wasn't there when I graduated from Trinity. um, I think both I and my parents knew that I wasn't ready. I didn't know what I wanted to do, so I wasn't ready for the real world. I had this wonderful support from my parents, not necessarily financially, but certainly emotionally, to hey, you need some more time to get whatever out of my system or start to focus. So when I graduated, I with a couple of Trinity roommates, we went over to Europe and backpacked for 8 weeks and had a blast. And then I had a close friend from high school that I spent a few summers on the vineyard with. So I went out to Martha's Vineyard and was working out there for a few months. And when that ended, other roommates from Trinity called and said, hey, we a bunch of us moved to Vail. Do you want to move out to Vail? We know you've always wanted to, be a ski instructor and thought this could be pretty fun. And they hadn't even finished the sentence. And I said, I'm in, right? I still wasn't ready. It was just a summer to get whatever out of my system. So I packed up a car and I drove out to Vail, and really one of the sort of greatest accomplishments other than marriage and my children for me was actually becoming a ski instructor at Vail. That, it was a whole week of tryouts and interviews and 200 people trying out for 12 spots, and it just was this incredible moment of
it sounds like Baywatch in the snow.
It was a little nuts. I think I made more money then than I do now, but it was so much fun. And you talk about the professional development. There were literally hundreds of people trying out for a handful of spots, and I had skied my whole life and skied out west and done all that quite a few times throughout my life. But there were skiers there that were much better than I. And at these tryouts, people are doing flips and helicopters and all this stuff that I just, I was decent, but I wasn't that good. But what I quickly realized was it was more than that, right? So they wanted people that could engage with adults, that could engage with teenagers, that could actually teach a class. And people, one of the biggest lessons I learned, and this was just something I did without realizing how it would work out well for me, was one of the final things you had to do was teach a class. You had to teach a class to your fellow students and a couple of the existing instructors. And everybody was teaching, this is how you ski bumps, this is how you do a whatever back scratcher off. People are showcasing their own skills on skis. Right. And I could keep up with them. I just wasn't one of the best. And when it became my turn, I said, okay, everybody, take your skis off. And I made everybody take their skis off. And I went into a very detailed description and taught a class for 20 minutes of how to make the perfect snowball. And then proceeded to have a snowball fight. And it was just something different. And again, hadn't thought about it for, days in advance. It was just like, hey, I'm watching what other people are doing. I'm watching how the instructors are reacting to it. I'm going to just do something different. And it actually, again, in hindsight, that worked out really well for me. They pulled me aside after and was like, that was genius. Like, you actually taught the class well. You did something completely different that nobody else would think about. And I think that was one of the reasons, honestly, that they took a chance on me and said, hey, you're going to be one of the 12 or one of the 20, whatever it was, that can actually take one of these spots. So it was pretty flattering.
That's a wonderful story. How long were you a ski instructor out there?
Just 1 year out in Vail. I spent about 18 months out there. And then it was, okay, time for the real world. And that's when I packed up my Jeep Woody and drove back across country with tears in my eyes, with a rainbow coming out of the, I-70 as I left Vail, but I knew it was time to, get real. So when I came back at that point, now I'm 2 years out of school, and a lot of my friends are back at business school or had been working at, record labels or back at medical school or whatever they were doing. So I was just trying to talk to people about what is your day like and what interests you. And almost every one of those conversations turned into, well, gee, Dave, you played sports in high school, you played some different sports in your freshman year in college, and then you taught skiing at Vail, which wasn't one of the 3 sports you played. Like, sports seems to be a part of who you are. And that was, I didn't really know that sports existed, the business of sports. I hadn't really thought about, like, the Sam Kennedy did when he was at college. I hadn't thought about the business of sports. So then I just started trying to work my way in to get, informational interviews, which, is a whole nother story. But yeah, that's how I started to lean into sports and saying, hey, this actually could be something I'm passionate about. Obviously, is this something I can make an impact on or with and actually have a career within.
Just to pause, Sam Kennedy was my year, and absolutely fantastic guy. But for those who don't know, he's the guy running the Red Sox right now, the old Fenway Sports Group. But if I remember the story correctly, he did have a leg up on everybody else because wasn't his best friend growing up Theo Epstein? So
yes.
I think like the two of them together, and I think his dad was a minister or something like that, so it kept him on
That
the
sounds
straight and
right.
narrow.
Yeah.
So when you think about you're going to go into sports and you go into an agency, did that just seem like just a good place to try different things? And an agency you kind of try out different jobs, they test you out and get a feel
That's
for it.
exactly right. So I had an informational interview with a young lady at Advantage International. It's now called Octagon is the name of the company, but she was actually leaving Advantage International, but she said, "Hey, come in, dress casually. We'll just have a half-hour conversation." Again, a friend of mine, and we sat down with her. I was in jeans and I think a V-neck sweater, casual as she suggested, and had a great conversation. And she said, "Listen, I have a friend of mine who's interviewing, for an internship, and you seem like, you're bright and you're passionate about sports. Let me get you some time with him." And I looked at her and said, "Hey, well, you told me to dress casually. I've seen everybody in the waiting room is in suits, and I guess soon they're interviewing for this." She said, "Don't worry about it. Just he's a really good guy." So I sat down with this guy for about 45 minutes, and lucky for me, at the end of the conversation, he said, "Listen, I'd love to hire you. Like, you seem great. Like, let's do this." Right. So hire you meant at the time, back in the mid 90s, I guess at that point, or early mid 90s, was I worked for him for free for 6 months, right? Like there was no money exchange, right? So, but what we were doing, they were running they called it a Legend tennis event in New Canaan, Connecticut, or maybe it was Darien. But we basically took over a racket club, an indoor racket club. We brought in legends like Chrissy Everett and the Jensen brothers and Rod Laver and John McEnroe, and we set up stands in this indoor, tennis facility, sold tickets, sold sponsorships, secured the players, wrote the press releases. We did everything A to Z around this event, which was fascinating for me, right? Like, I got to learn so much about what the physical part of putting together an event, as well as what's the business side of all of this. So that was my first step into that agency world of learning how to run events. And I was there for about 6 months, and then they made me an offer to go down to work in their corporate office in McLean, Virginia, in a similar role. Ultimately, was there for about 6 years, but ultimately the original guy who hired me, he and I went and started the Chicago office for Advantage International at the time. This was, again, probably now the late 90s. And at that point, I switched over to a consultant role. So I was representing a brand, and that brand was Sears, who was headquartered in Chicago or outside of Chicago. And I helped negotiate Sears' first deal with the WNBA. So they were one of the founding partners of the WNBA. And that was really, again, for me, a step in a whole new direction of negotiating with the, big bad league and on behalf of a client, and figuring out how are we going to market this partnership, what players are we going to sign, how are we going to activate at retail. Again, a whole new sort of world for me. But that introduced me to then the NBA, right? So the NBA was obviously running the NBA, the WNBA. It was one group at the time. It wasn't two separate groups. Unfortunately for me, about 2 years in, they called me and said, "Hey, we have a role. We really like you. We'd like you to come interview if you're interested." I originally, like an idiot, said, "No, thanks. I was single and having fun in Chicago, one of the most amazing cities I've ever lived in." And fortunately for me, they called 2 weeks later and said, "Are you sure?" It's just a conversation. And I accepted it, or said, "Hey, yeah, you're right. I'd love to come talk to you." And ultimately, it was a really wonderful opportunity to go work in the partnership marketing group at the NBA.
Which is in New York.
Which is in New York, right?
She's in New York. She had to move from Chicago to New York.
Back to New York, and working under, at the time, a guy named Mark Tatum, who's now the deputy commissioner of the NBA, a wonderful guy. So it was there for about 5 years.
And let me pause there. When you think about, I have this, you're negotiating these deals. So you're on, one side of this, and now you go to the other side. Mm-hmm. I can see where it'd be very intellectually challenging, very intellectually interesting, but did you have a particular passion for basketball, or was it more the work you were doing was what was motivating you, and basketball was, a fun sport? But
yeah, I mean, that's another great question, Paul. And the truth is, I did not like professional basketball. I was not a fan of professional basketball. College hoops, I could watch all day long. And shockingly, and I'm surprised they still hired me, but in my last interview, I admitted that to my last interviewer. So, or interviewee, he actually asked the question, who do you think is going to be in the finals? And I was not interested in the NBA. I was worried I was going to say two teams from the same conference, that I just said, oh, the Lakers, nobody's going to touch Shaq and Kobe, whatever it was, it just sort of pivoted quickly. But I admitted it, I finally said, listen, I'm not here. I told the person, I'm not here because I'm a passionate NBA fan, which is honestly what they hear in every other interview.
Yeah.
I said, I'm here because I'm interested in the business. This was maybe the first or second time Jordan had retired. There was this explosion of growth overseas with folks like Yao Ming and Dirk Nowitzki. Like all those guys were, at the height of their careers or just getting started, right? So there was this really cool business aspect that I was more interested in than sitting courtside at a Knicks game, right? It was really the business side that drew me towards it.
This sounds very similar though to you, giving a ski lesson by making snowballs. I mean, you kind of going in and saying, look, it's not that I'm a groupie and I went to every single Chicago Bulls game when I was living in Chicago. It was, I find this interesting and I'm curious as to how these partnerships work. Is that a fair way to put it?
It's absolutely fair. Now, when I finally went to the NFL, I'm actually a big NFL fan.
Well, that's what I was gonna say. Like after 5 years at the NBA, did they get sick of you saying, I don't really like professional basketball, and say, look, Lynch, go work for the NFL?
Yeah. Well, it was possibly the most flattering part of my career when the NFL called, because I didn't know people at the NFL, and they reached out to me and said, hey, we have a position we'd love for you to interview for. I learned my lesson when the NBA called, where I say yes the first time. I'd love to go. I had nothing to lose. I was, the NBA was tough. It was a tough environment, but I often describe it as I got my MBA at the NBA, because we were so buttoned up. We analyzed everything, sometimes overanalyzed things, but it was an incredible learning experience. The NFL calls and ultimately has a position, and it was about 4 months of interviewing. I do recall my last interview was with the CMO at the time. And I was on the train from Connecticut going in, and my wife's water broke with our first child. And I called the CMO's, admin and said, hey, listen, I'm really sorry. I have to, we're gonna have to reschedule. And of course she said, oh, well, Mr. Horacio is not going to be disappointed. We've been trying to schedule this. He's not in the office. And I said, I'm really sorry. My wife's water just broke. I got to go. Immediately 180s. Oh my gosh, Mr. Lynch, I'm so sorry. Yes, go home. We'll call you in 2 weeks. And to their credit, I thought I was out because I knew it was down to 2 people. And I said, it's fine. I'm happy at the NBA. My wife just had about to have our first child. I'm good. But to their credit, they called 2 weeks later. They sent us flowers, and they said, hey, we'd like to reschedule the interview. And ultimately I got the role. So when I asked them later, and this is the flattering part, I said, how did you hear my name? I don't work with anyone at the NFL, and I'm just curious. And I should have connected the dots myself, but they said, listen, we have the same people that sponsor the NFL sponsor the NBA. And we asked our sponsors, our partners, who should we hire for this role? And they said, several of them, without fail, said, hey, you got to go talk to Dave Lynch at the NBA. Go talk to Dave Lynch. So I'll never forget that. I found later, after I had accepted, who those partners were. And I'm forever in debt to those guys for, actually saying kind things and putting me up for that role.
But when it came time to negotiate deals with them, you didn't give them a break, right? You were still just as hard nosed. Right?
They don't expect it.
So, and then for, listeners, going, it's one thing to go from Chicago to New York to work for the NBA, but the NBA is just a couple blocks away from the NFL. So literally you're taking the train in. And where were you living at the time? So you're taking the train in from Connecticut.
So I was most of the time at the NBA, I was in Manhattan on the Upper West Side. And then the last year or so, we had just moved out my wife and I moved out to Fairfield, Connecticut. So, I've been doing the commute about a year at that point. And now here we are, 16 years into the NFL. So it's been, that commute, that grind.
So talk to me. What was, you said you were a fan of professional football. You love the NFL. What was your first day like when you had the job and here you're Dave Lynch working for the NFL? You walk in, what was it like?
It was, a little nerve wracking, like any new job, no matter how long you've been doing what you do is, but excitement. my first day, I got in the office, and I think from probably where he parked his private car, the doors open and Commissioner Tagliabue was staring at me as I stepped into my first day in the office. We rode the elevator up together, and um, you know, good morning, Commissioner. So, but that same week, I think he announced his retirement and he was moving on. So I don't know if I drove him out of the league or not, but so I didn't get a whole lot
What
of
did you say? What did you say to him in the elevator? Like that he said, that's enough.
Wow, you're tall. I think that was it. Yeah, but it was incredible. Now I will say again, the NFL is amazing. We do, our commissioner is incredible. Leadership is wonderful, and particularly who I report to. I get a long leash to do what I do, and there's a lot of trust there. Being with the two people that I work with most closely for 16 years in the partnership marketing group. But again, I don't think I would be where I was, and I'm not saying the NFL is it for me, but I wouldn't be where I am today if I didn't have all that experience from the agency world, and not just working in events, but then switching to consulting and working in 3 different offices, and then not unknowingly that opportunity turned into a sports property, then saying, hey, you seem to be doing pretty good work and we like your personality and think you could handle this. We'd love to have you join us at the NBA. And then 5 years later, because of, fortunately for me, the reputation apparently I had or have, put me up for a position at the NFL. So I would never, very few people start their career at the National Football League. I think Roger Goodell might be, one of the only few that have been there his or her entire career. And a lot of advice that I give folks that want to get into sports is, of course, everybody wants to be at the NBA or the NFL or, NHL, whatever the case may be, but we're hiring people who have experience, like you said earlier, on the other side of the table, or that are building up to a certain point where, okay, yes, we want that level of expertise. We want that experience in our group. So a lot of people think it's just, I want to go work at the NFL, but that's not typically how it works.
Yeah. I think of the time that you've been there. You started what, 2005, 2006? Is that
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep. 2006.
So the whole world is on the upswing in 2006, 2008, 2009. It's on the downswing, starts to go up. But do you think of the evolution of television rights, of how we consume sports, of, what a stadium looks like, then and now? How have partnerships changed over that time?
Yeah, well, it's changed quite a bit, and you hit on all the right points. It is, content is still king. When I think about the first deal we had with the wireless, in the wireless category at the NFL, with, I think at the time it was with Sprint, what that's become and how that's evolved. Right, there wasn't a whole lot of content within that sponsorship, meaning NFL live games or highlights, et cetera, on that service. Where that's just developed so much over the years to morphed into a Verizon relationship, where content was leading the partnership. And then we look at now, to your point, on our broadcast deals and what our NBC, CBS, Fox with Paramount, Peacock, and others, or how you can actually access live content, and what we're going to do moving forward, right? With whether that's Sunday Ticket or our mobile rights. Where are we going to have, what partner are we going to have that's actually going to help us reach our fans? And that's consistent with the NFL. Is we want our content to be where the fans want it, where the fans are. So we're trying to make sure that whether you're at home on your couch in front of a 50-inch 4K TV, or you're at your son's lacrosse game in New Canaan somewhere, that you're able to access the games when and how you want it. So that continues to be a focus that didn't exist, to your point, it's that many years. Even going to SoFi Stadium, right? Like when I came in, MetLife was just getting started, and it's an amazing venue. And then you fast forward to walking into SoFi Stadium. It's just, even for me, I've been to every stadium, just about every stadium in the league, and walk into that venue, it's your jaw's on the ground. It's really impressive of what they've done.
Yeah. I'm thinking that, because I live in New Canaan, if there's anything you can do to get better cell service in New Canaan, I promise to watch every football game on my cell phone.
Great.
When anybody who's been at an organization, 10 plus years, 16 years or so now, you've got to find a way to constantly challenge yourself, or if not constantly, regularly challenge yourself.
Mhm.
So as you try to push yourself and ensure the people you work with have pushed you as well, but you have to have some inner drive to make something like this work as long as it has. How have you defined, success over the years at the NFL?
Yeah, so I've been fortunate enough to follow this model, and I've witnessed so many coworkers do the same. But people, the reality is, again, I love our work. I love the people, certainly love the product, but we're not perfect. And a lot of people will put organizations on a pedestal that they do everything right. We do a lot of things right, but not everything right. The key in this organization where I currently work is, and this is a blessing, is that if you see a hole or a need or something that's broken, you have the ability to go try and fix it, right? Or make it better. The greatest example for me is when I came to the NFL, that we had let's call it 20 different partnerships at the time. And a lot of them were in the tech space. And there was a lot of crossover between Motorola and Sprint and IBM, and like people in the sponsorship world, you're selling a category to somebody and they're using the NFL marks to differentiate themselves within that category. But these big companies naturally have businesses that conflict with other partners. So I raised my hand and said, hey, let me oversee these technology partners. I want to make sure they stay in their swim lanes. I want to understand their business. Once I understand their business, I'm going to take I'm making it up. I'm going to take a $10 million deal and I'm going to make it 100 million, right? So the idea was to try and learn what's important to those partners, make sure that they're focused on that, but then grow the business, not in a genuine way, not in a way that forces them to spend more with us, but that they want to spend more with us. So I can't even spell technology, and I came in and made myself the technology expert in the partnership world at the NFL. I didn't know everything, but I knew more than anybody else in my group. So that was an area that I was able to gravitate towards because I saw a need for somebody to pull this all together. And yes, our Bose deal, as you mentioned, started as a speaker deal. And as I got to understand their business, and they were struggling with this new company called Beats, 8 years ago,
Yeah.
it was an opportunity for me to say, hey, well, wait, Bose, you've told me over time that you make the headsets for the U.S. Army in tanks, that you make headsets for aviation needs with helicopters and airplanes. So you have the technology and actually the wherewithal to put this together and change the game, right? You want to combat this company called Beats. Let's start playing with the big boys here and let's get on the NFL sidelines, and you can change the game and have branding and awareness of how you change the game with noise canceling technology. One example, right? But
Yeah.
Xbox or Microsoft was just an Xbox deal, and now their tablets are on the sidelines, right? So there are several examples of we had relationships that started at a certain level, and as we get to know their business, we're able to develop those relationships into something bigger and better for both parties, not just for the NFL, but for that partner as well.
And I mean, with Bose, did you have to work with them to make sure there was enough space between the microphone and the mouth to sort of cover up the lips? Was that something
Yeah,
you kind of
all
worked
of
it
that.
out?
You'd be shocked at that even a technology like that is not a plug and play. So we were testing that product for just about a year before we actually put it on the sidelines to make sure it worked.
Like tossing it after a bad call and seeing if
Oh yeah, we
if
call
it
that
still
coach
worked.
proofing. Yeah.
Coach,
Yeah.
I love it, coach proofing. This has been great, Dave. Now I have to add, last question before we go into a fun thing at the end. Tom Brady just retired. I mean, do you have anything else left to accomplish? I mean, what do you do going forward here, huh?
Yeah, well, there's
What?
a bright future for us, at the league. We're really excited about the last season, and hopefully you watch some of the games. But in my 16 years, I've never seen anything like it. Right, just with the overtime games leading the playoffs. At some point, even in December, I think I apologize, I don't have the most recent numbers, but in early December, we had realized there were, I think, 30 games that had ended in the last play of the game. And
Yeah.
that was before all the playoff games, right? It was this amazing season of wonderful football that I think a lot of, obviously based on results and awareness and even viewership that it's just been an amazing season.
Before the Super Bowl, I did a bunch of interviews with some NFL guys for this project I'm working on now called the Company of Dads, and all the guys were fathers, and most of them had won a Super Bowl, and they kept asking me, who are you rooting for? And I said, I'm rooting for the Bengals. Like, oh, the quarterback, you love it. It's like, no, not the quarterback. It's like, you always root for the quarterback. It's like, no, the kicker. Like Evan McPherson. Like I was like, the kicker. I was like, think of like how, and it was almost in the Super Bowl. They almost got there to where the kicker would have kicked the field goal.
Yeah.
To tie. I mean,
yeah,
he was to
watch.
me so exciting. And people are looking at me and I'm talking to these guys, linemen, quarterbacks, like the kicker. It's like, this guy is, my first book was called Clutch, Why Some People Excel Under Pressure and Others Don't. And that, to me, being that kind of nerdy guy, like Evan McPherson was just amazing. Like just the sheer amount of pressure to, launch a 35-yard field goal, a 50-yard field goal, and to keep advancing the teams. It was good to watch.
Calm, cool, and collected, right? Like, and confident, right?
Yeah. All right, Dave. So now we get to this point that we do with all of these podcasts, and it's called the Beyond the Summit Fast Five. Okay.
Oh boy.
So the only rule is you don't think, you just answer.
Oh boy. Okay.
All right. You ready? And it's fast five. So it's only gonna be 5 questions. That's it. Okay.
Is this like a one-word answer or is this an answer?
You answer how you want to answer it. I'm not gonna tell you how to answer. Whatever you want to say. Number 1, Dave Lynch. What did you want to be when you arrived at Trinity?
A teacher.
Okay. Number 2, what's one thing that happened at Trinity that your colleagues never knew about you?
Oh my gosh. I think most of my friends don't know that the lacrosse coach told me I was the biggest disappointment recruitment he's ever experienced. To my face. Yeah.
Well, there's something wonderfully direct about that. It kind of sort of ended it there. There's no need.
I probably deserved it. Yeah, I probably deserved it.
Oh man. Number 3, when you look back on the narrative of your life to date, was there a moment at Trinity that was instrumental in you becoming who you are today?
I do think that, dumb luck for me, I somehow gravitated towards a group of friends that are just amazing people. And to this day, they are, 6 of my closest friends, and it goes beyond the 6, but there are guys that every year I travel to a different city with these 5 other guys, and it's clockwork. We do not miss it. It is, somebody picks a city, we fly to that city, we spend 3 or 4 nights together, have the time of our lives, we take off and we come back and do it again a year later. This is now what, almost 30 years later.
Yeah.
And it's really fascinating. And the fact that for me, I feel so fortunate that these 5 guys in particular also are now close with my closest Hopkins friends, where I went to high school. So I've got this group that is just bright, generous, smart, successful in their own ways, like just really, really, that's something I feel so fortunate. When I think about Trinity, first thing that comes to mind for me is not sports, it's not the classes, it's not SIU, it is the group of friends that I created.
Yeah. Great. Number 4, what advice would you give to a current Trinity student who aspires to use his or her sports background after college?
Call Sam Kennedy.
Put that on a t-shirt. And number 5, if the Trinity Bantam had been one of your trusted advisors, what role would that fierce bird have played in your life?
Oh boy.
I'm having this image of you, Paul Tagliabue, and the Bantam all in the elevator together on day 1.
Holy cow. One of my most trusted advisors. Can you ask the question again? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I just want to make sure I'm gathering this.
If the Trinity Bantam had been one of your trusted advisors, what role would the fierce chicken play?
If I was leading into the Bantam, I feel like, and this is no regrets, but I do feel like as much as I got out of Trinity and a wonderful experience like you, Paul, I just, I have very few regrets. but I do wish that I had just maybe a little bit more direction earlier in my career at Trinity. Again, to go from a math major to an econ major to an international relations major, for me was great. But at the same time, I wish I could have dialed that in sooner, right? Like I was kind of all over the map for the first year and a half I was there, but I wish that I could have maybe had some help to dial that in a little bit. Everything worked out fine, but
everything worked out
that's
great.
an area that, I think that's an area that in hindsight, if I had a trusted advisor in the Bantam, that maybe it could push me in the right direction.
See, I wanted you to sort of be more literal. And I had this vision of you negotiating a big deal and you're like, you don't agree with this? Okay, bring him in. And the Bantam comes in. The chicken comes in and sits at the table, and Roger Goodell is looking at you like, Dave, what the hell are you doing here? This is what. And he's like, don't worry, trust me, it's the chicken. No, everybody fears the bird.
Mm-hmm.
Dave Lynch, thank you for being my guest today on Beyond the Summit podcast. I've really enjoyed it.
My pleasure, Paul. Thanks for the time. It's nice to catch up as well.
Same.
This episode of Beyond the Summit was brought to you by the Trinity College Office of Communications. Special thanks to Caroline DeVoe, Ellen Buckhorn, and Mary Mahoney for production assistance. This episode was produced by Helder Mira.
A big thank you to Paul Sullivan, our alumnus host. The theme music, Winter in Liverpool by Mulaha, licensed by MusicBed. Thanks for listening and tune in next time.